Hey guys, it's Chris from Highland Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to pick up where I left off with the last episode that I posted, where I talked about scuffing or abrading between each application of my water-based clear coat finish. And if you haven't seen that episode, I'll be sure to post a link up here so you can go back, check it out, and get caught up with what I'm doing. But what I'm going to talk about in this episode is the next step in the process, which is how I level sand my cured clear coat prior to buffing it up to a high gloss shine. And what I'm going to talk about specifically is the technique that I use and the materials that I use. And this is my process that I like to use, and it's one that I've developed over time. And it may differ from what you use or what you're used to seeing other folks use. So let's jump in and get started. I'll bring you in a little bit closer. First of all, let me give you kind of a rundown of the materials and tools that I use for level sanding. And it's important to understand the process that I'm going to demonstrate here is a dry sanding process. You can also do a wet sanding process, which is pretty much the traditional method that luthiers have been using for decades to achieve a high gloss finish on their guitars. I used to wet sand all the time, and it worked quite well for me. However, when I made the switch over to water-based finishes, early on it was recommended that you follow a dry sanding technique. And so I started to pursue that approach. And what I have found over the years is the abrasive products that are available for dry sanding have improved dramatically. And in fact, I would hazard to say that there's been more research and development in the area of dry sanding than there has been in recent years with wet sanding. And as a result, there are some products that are available that perform in an amazing level. And what I'm going to be using to start with is a couple of papers. And I'm going to start with a 400 grit. This is a P400 grit 3M 213U sandpaper. And it's basically just a no load. You can get this pretty much at any of your big box hardware stores. And I'm going to start with a 400 grit, and then I'm going to move up to a 3M 216U free cut gold paper, and this is a 600 grit. Now you'll notice these are two different sizes. This one's smaller than this one. And the reason is, with the 400 grit, the only thing I'm going to use it for is to do some spot sanding wherever I may encounter dust nibs and a run or drip or anything like that. The most offensive flaws in the surface. Now, when I sprayed this, I was really careful to avoid dust, runs, all of that. And as a result, I have a pretty smooth surface. Now, I do have a couple of spots right in here. These are little dust nibs, and you probably can't see them, but I'm going to hit those with the 400 grit, and then I'm just going to wrap it. I go to the dollar store and purchase these really cheap rubber erasers, and then I can just wrap them around and then use that to do my spot leveling on those really offensive spots. Now, once I have completed touching up those little areas, I'm going to go over the entire surface with the 600 grit free cut gold paper. And again, this is a rubber eraser that I picked up at the dollar store. This is actually a great big eraser. And I just cut it into pieces. And these things work really well as a sanding block because they conform to the surface quite well, especially if it's a carved top or round side contours. But I will sand the entire surface in an effort to get it as level as possible. And I will work to get it to about 80 to 90% level. From there, I'm going to move on to a different product. And this is a product from Japan called Super Acelix. And there's a couple of names that you'll need to be aware of. Kovacs is one, Super Asalix, as I mentioned, is the other, and Eagle Abrasives. I think it's Eagle Abrasives sells this product. It's Kovacs Super Asalix. But what this is a flexible sheet, abrasive sheet. And I'm going to be sanding first with 600, then 800, 1000, 1200, and then 1500. Now with these papers, as I said before, these are P-grade papers. And you know it's a P-grade paper if the grit designation on the back has the letter P in front of it. And that means it is a European standard grading system for the abrasive grits that were used to make the sandpaper. And P-grade papers use abrasives that are more consistent in their shape and size, so they do a better job of sanding a consistent surface than what you would normally get with your, like your US grit designations. So if it doesn't have a P, it's probably a US designation. If it has a P, it's the European designation. That's what I use. Now these Super Asalix sheets have a K designation. And I'm not 100% sure what the K designation is. I believe it's a Japanese grading system for abrasives. At any rate, I find that when I go from a 600 grit P grade to a 600 grit K graded sheet, this one is just a step above the P grade in terms of surface quality. So I think it's pretty safe to go from a P600 to a K600. And then I would work my way through the other grits as I refine the surface quality. But these abrasive sheets they're fairly expensive. Now I'm going to put links to all these products down in the description below so that you can go check them out yourself. But if you shop around, you can find accessory or variety packs, and you can also find some fairly good deals on these sheets. But the one thing that you should bear in mind with these sheets is that you can typically use a single sheet of each one of these grits on about, I would say, 5 to 8 guitars before they need to be replaced. So they last a long time. And that makes it somewhat more economical. And to use them, these are just it's a sort of a hook and loop fastening system, so it attaches like this. And I will start and begin to show you the methods and the technique that I use for level sanding through all these different grits. I will start the process by using the 400 grit wrapped around the rubber eraser. And I'm just going to do a very light spot sanding of a couple of these little dust nibs. And I don't think you can see it in the video, unfortunately, but trust me, they're there. So I'll just sand these down, and I'm going to sand in a very small circular sanding pattern, and that will quickly lower those spots down until they are level with the surrounding surface. And the goal here is just to make sure that you don't overdo it. You know, don't be too aggressive in the sanding. Just get it down to where it's just starting to get level. And then once I have that completed, I can then move on to the next step in the level sanding process. As you might be able to see in the highlights, this clear coat has kind of a slight bumpy texture to it, and that's really common with water-based acrylics and polyurethanes. They dry with an almost orange peel-like texture to it. So that's mainly what I'm going to be focused on as I level sand. And I'm going to use my rubber eraser. I'm going to wrap the 600 grit, P600 grit sandpaper around it. And then I'll just begin sanding. And I'm going to sand in a circular motion because sanding in a circular motion is the most aggressive way to level this surface. And the most work that will be done is going to take place with this initial P600 grit. That's where we do most of the leveling. And when I say leveling, what we're doing is we're bringing down the high spots so that they are the same level as the low spots. And that will leave a very smooth, consistent surface. But as I said, with this first grit of sandpaper, this is where we're going to be doing the most work. And at this stage, I'm going to try to speed things up by using a circular sanding stroke. And I'll sand in a spot and then move on to the next. And really, you want to kind of concentrate on sanding these areas in manageable chunks. You don't want to be trying to do the entire surface. I mean, you could, but it just doesn't feel like you're really making much progress. So I'll start with just a small area and work my way around. Now, as I start to build up sanding powder, I'm going to need to clean the sandpaper. And even though this is described as a no-load sandpaper, it will load up. It just does. And there's really not much you can do to avoid that. So I just keep a paper towel handy, and it wipes off pretty easily. And then I can also wipe off the surface here and gauge my progress as I'm sanding. Now, if you want to speed it up, you could definitely go down in grits to, say, a 400 grit. But I find that when you do that, the scratches that the 400 grit leaves can tend to take quite a bit of time and effort to remove as you move through the grit. So you're really not going to be saving a great deal of time starting out with a coarser grit. Another option is to use a random orbital sander and use sanding discs. In truth, there are just a wide variety of different ways that you can approach this. However, when using like a random orbital sander, you can expect to potentially sand through your finish because they have a tendency to really remove a lot of material fast. So what I would recommend if you want to try going that route is to use a variable speed random orbital sander and then set the speed as low as possible. And by doing that, you can decrease the potential for sanding through. I'm not going to tell you that you're going to eliminate that potential because those random orbital sanders really have a tendency to remove material fast. Now, the goal here with this initial level sanding grit session with the P600 grit is to sand the surface to about 90 to 95% of what you need it to be, 90 to 95% perfectly level. The reason why you don't want to try to go all the way to 100 is because of the potential for sand through. And it may not happen right away. It may not happen until you get up into the higher grits. But if you take the P600 and sand it to about 90 to 95% and then continue with your the K800 or 600, 800, 1000, 1200, 1500, by the time you get to the end, you'll have everything level and you will do so without that potential for sanding through the finish. So especially for those of you who are just doing this for the first time, I recommend that you don't start by trying to level all the way to a perfectly level surface. Get close, but try to discipline yourself to stop just short of that. And I think you'll find your efforts are more successful and you have less of an issue with the sand through that can be a disaster. Okay, so a question that comes up a lot is, how do you know when to move from one area to the next or when to move up in grits? Well, what you're trying to do is sand the surface to a uniform matte sheen. If you see shiny spots, those are low spots. And what we're trying to do is bring the high spots down so that they're level with those low spots. So you wouldn't want to move to the next area or switch to a finer grit until you have minimized the number of shiny spots. So what you can do is you can hold the guitar, as I'm doing here, up to a bright light and look for those shiny spots. And if you see quite a few of them still on the surface, you know you need to keep working that area. And of course, you can't move up to the next finer grit until you've minimized those shiny spots. Now, as I said before, you don't necessarily want to try to sand out every single one of those shiny spots, because the more you linger in an area with your coarse grit, the greater the potential for sanding through the finish. So you want to try to remove 90 to 95% of them and then move on to the next area or to your next grit. Okay, before we move on, let me give you a couple of pearls of level sanding wisdom. During this initial phase of level sanding, as I said before, you want to try to sand to 90 to 95% level finish. And that means you may still see a couple of shiny spots here and there on the surface. Don't fret about those too much. If you really try to obsess and get every bit of the surface perfectly level and remove all of those shiny spots, there's a good chance you're going to sand through your clear coat and into the underlying finish, which is going to cause all kinds of problems. So for your first stab at this, don't worry about those. Now, if you do see a spot that's maybe a little bit deeper and you know that's going to cause problems later on and that it's always going to be there, you could just take a small brush and dab in a little bit of your clear coat, let it dry, lightly sand it, and then dab in another and continue to do that until you bring it back up level with the surface. But for the most part, I wouldn't worry too much about that. Another area you want to be aware of are your edges, sharp points, roundovers. During this initial phase of level sanding, don't worry about those. Try to stay back as you sand these areas and don't sand over them, because you will likely sand through that clear coat and into the underlying finish. So to avoid that, just kind of stay back from those. And then later on, as we move through these other grits, we will address those in a much less destructive manner. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to start moving through these other grits. So let me bring you back in close. Okay, so the next step is to what I call polish sanding. And I'm going to use these Super Acrylics abrasive sheets with the Super Acrylic sanding block. And what I'll do is I will start with a K600 grit, sand the entire surface, top, sides, back, and then I'll switch to the K800 and I'll move all the way up, and eventually I will finish with the K1500 grit. And by the time I get to this stage, the surface will actually begin to develop a polish, and I'll be able to see reflections in the surface if I look at it at a low angle. And what we're actually accomplishing here is with each grit, we're reducing the severity of the scratches left by the previous grit. So it's basically a method of polishing. We're not doing any leveling because the leveling is already done. That's what was accomplished with the P600 grit. So I'm just going to start. And one thing you want to do, this is a tip for polish sanding, is before you start to polish sand, after you've leveled, look at the surface at a low angle against a bright light and get an idea of what the surface sheen looks like. And then start sanding. And what you can do is sand just one small area of the body with the K600 grit. And go over it a couple of times and then stop and check it again at a low angle against a bright light. And you'll notice that the surface sheen where you just sanded with the K600 is going to look different than the surface area that was sanded and leveled previously with the P600. That shows you the difference in the scratch pattern. And you can't really see this if you look straight at it. It's hard to see, but if you look at it at a low angle against a bright light, you can see the difference in surface quality. And what you're going to want to do is continue sanding the entire surface and cover it with the same level of surface sheen. So once you have sanded the entire surface, and you're going to probably work one area at a time, like you'll do just the top first, then you'll do the sides and then the back. But once you have covered the entire surface with your K600 grit, you can check it against a bright light at a low angle. And as long as the entire surface has a consistent sheen and there aren't any spots that appear different, then you know you're done and can move on to the next grit. The key here is to exercise some restraint. Don't linger too long over any specific area, and don't sand for too long. Know when to stop. The more you sand, the greater the chances of sanding through your finish. Now, what I like to do is I'll sand the entire top, the sides, and the back. And while I'm doing this, I don't worry about sanding over these edges or the sharp corners or roundovers. It's pretty hard to sand through with the 600, especially if you're not lingering in any area for too long. But then once I'm done, I'll run my finger around the edge or any roundovers, and I'm looking for any spots that might be kind of rough. And if I encounter any, I'll give it just a quick touch with this 600. Don't do too much sanding. Don't spend too much time. Don't be sitting here doing this kind of thing for too long. Just sort of run it around and then check with your fingers. And as long as you don't feel any really rough spots, you're good to go, and you don't need to continue to work those areas. But once I'm finished with the 600, the K600, I'll move to the K800 and do the exact same thing again. Now here's another tip. With each grit, you can sand in different directions. So you could start out sanding with the grain using the 600, then switch to the 800 and sand across the grain. And you'll notice as you look at it at a low angle against a bright light, you can really start to see where the change in direction is changing the surface sheen. So it helps you to know when you have finished with one grit and are ready to move on to the next grit. Okay, here's some things to consider as you're polish sanding. First of all, these sheets will load up with sanding residue, but it's simply a matter of wiping it off onto a paper towel and they come clean. You can also use a paper towel to sort of wipe down the surface, removing that excess so that you can really check your work closely and see what your progress is. Another thing to consider is as you're sanding, you may notice some scratches in the surface that appear to be more pronounced than the surrounding area. If that happens, just kind of work those areas a little bit longer until you see those scratches fade away. If they don't fade away, you may have to back down to a coarser grit to take care of those, but just work that area. And then once those scratches have disappeared, you can just work your way back up through your grits. Another thing you'll notice is, and this is especially true if you used a water-based product like a water-based polyurethane or a water-based acrylic. I used a water-based polyurethane on this. But because those products, each coat lays on top of the previous coat, as you're level sanding that top final coat, oftentimes what happens is you expose the underlying layers and you'll get what are known as witness lines. And I'll try to shoot a photo that will demonstrate what I'm talking about because it's hard to explain. But you're going to see this all over the surface, and a lot of people freak out when they see that. Don't worry about it. It's no big deal, especially if you're going to be buffing out later on using a buffing machine and solid compounds, because those do a great job of just completely erasing those witness lines. So you'll see them now as you're sanding, but don't worry about them. Now that's basically the technique that I use for level sanding and polish sanding my clear coats prior to taking the guitar to the buffing machine. And I'll be talking about that in a future episode. I'll kind of walk you through how I use my buffing machine and my Menzerna solid compounds to achieve a high gloss shine. But one thing I want to stress is this is sort of a new method for level sanding and polish sanding. In the past we've been using wet sanding techniques, which work really well, but with the advances in technology behind these new abrasives, you can omit the water and do a dry sanding technique. And it doesn't matter whether you sprayed a water-based polyurethane like I did, or nitrocellulose, 2K poly, or polyester. This level sanding and polish sanding technique will work for any of those clear coat type finishes. One thing to bear in mind is, even though I have given you some pointers on how to do the level sanding and polish sanding, it is important to know that watching this video isn't going to make you an expert. You can't just watch this and then head out to your shop and expect perfect success. This is something that does take a little bit of experience and some skill to master. However, with these products and these techniques, you will, the first time out, likely come closer to achieving the success you hope for. And if it isn't absolutely perfect the first time out, just know that with repetition, you will eventually achieve an amazing high gloss mirror-like shine with no distortion in the reflections. But who knows, you may get that the first time out. Could happen. You might have that touch, that magic touch when it comes to level sanding and polish sanding. At any rate, I hope this video was useful to you. I hope it will inspire you to give this a shot. I'll put links to these products down in the description below. And I will see you in the next episode. And I hope you have a great weekend, a great week ahead, and we'll see you soon.